Architectural Outcast.
Welcome to the Architectural Outcast critique of Star Trek The Original Series, Season 1, Episode 3, Where No Man Has Gone Before. I'm Randy, and this time around, we have the question, does power corrupt, or does power reveal character? In this episode, the Enterprise discovers the black box of a previously unknown Earthship, and in an effort to figure out what happened to that ship, they follow its last known course and end up flying through an anomaly that gives two of the crew members, Gary and Elizabeth, amazing mental powers, ESP. At the same time that the anomaly takes out the Enterprise's warp engines, it simultaneously knocks out Lieutenant Commander Gary Mitchell and Dr. Elizabeth Dahlner. Upon awakening, Gary and Elizabeth now have ESP, the ability to manipulate things with their mind. Gary manifests his power right away, and it's only later that we learn of Elizabeth's abilities. Gary and Elizabeth decide that they are way better than normal humans. They end up running off to become the Adam and Eve of an all-new, superior human civilization. Gary believes that he is now a god, and that humans should worship him or die. Elizabeth ends up sacrificing herself to prevent Gary from murdering Kirk. We have an interesting conundrum. Two people are given extraordinary power, and they end up using it in very different ways. Gary wants to use his power to dominate and control, and is willing to crush anybody or anything that gets in his way. Whereas Elizabeth ends up using her power in an act of self-sacrifice, in an effort to save another person. Does power corrupt, or does power reveal character? The show gives us quite a few clues. We meet Gary and Elizabeth roughly around the same time. Gary is self-confident to the point of being cocky. He even has a bit of a superiority complex, treating Spock with condescension. The episode makes it clear right away that Gary's a playboy, using women for his own entertainment. And when he first meets Elizabeth, right away he hits on her. And she cuts him down to size, stops him cold. His reaction? Well, if she's not into me, that's clearly a sign she has problems, if you know what I mean. When the Enterprise gets to the dangerous part of the mission, instead of focusing on his job, flying a ship through an unknown anomaly, Gary spends the whole time holding the hand of a pretty young crew member. Because, priorities. Once Gary gets zapped and starts to manifest his power, we learn that he and Kirk had been at the academy at the same time, where Kirk was an upperclassman already legendary for the class that he taught that demanded students think. We learn that while at the academy, Gary got a female classmate to approach Kirk and then planned out every one of her actions in an effort for her to seduce Kirk. And it worked to the point that Kirk almost married the woman. And why did Gary do this? Because he could. Gary then reveals to Kirk that he's been reading the philosopher Spinoza. Now, this is important for a number of reasons, and we'll come back to this later. But the first reason this is important is because Gary doesn't pull that he's a god out of thin air. Spinoza argued that the only thing that exists in the universe is God, and that everything we encounter, planets, rocks, gas, animals, us humans, are just various manifestations of God. If humans are just manifestations of God, and Gary as a human with superior powers is a superior manifestation of God, thus he is God. Now, even within the framework Spinoza lays out, it doesn't take a genius to figure out the flaws in Gary's argument. Self-serving argument, I might add, but we'll get to that in a bit. My point, Gary doesn't pull all of this out of thin air. When Elizabeth comes to observe Gary and his new powers, the first thing Gary does is try to dominate the woman who previously rejected him. And when he's interrupted by the arrival of another crew member, he has to show his superiority by telling the crew member that he knows more about that guy's job than that guy. Kirk and company figure out that Gary has been sneakily manipulating levers and buttons with his mind, learning how to control the ship all by himself. When confronted, Gary reveals that he is now a god and all will bow before him. Kirk and Spock jump Gary, beat the stuffing out of him, sedate him, then bum rush him to the surface of the planet where they've arrived in an effort to fix the engines, where they then stuff Gary in a high-security cell. When Gary tries to just walk through the security shield, it weakens his mental powers to the point he becomes a normal human for a few moments. Might be an important detail a bit later. Once Gary convinces Elizabeth to let him out of the cell and then to run off with them to start their new civilization, in the process, he kills one of the crew. Not just any old crew, one of his friends. When Kirk chases Gary and Elizabeth down to confront them for what they've done, the first thing Gary does, force Kirk onto his knees in an attempt to force Kirk to worship him. Contrast that with Elizabeth. When we first meet her, we learn she's a visiting doctor assigned to the Enterprise to study how crews respond to high-stress situations. Kirk's reaction is, fine, whatever, do what you gotta do, kinda busy here, and moves on. She follows Kirk, continuing to talk. Hey, if you find yourselves in a high-stress situation, let me know. I would be interested because I'm here to study that. Elizabeth is a bit self-absorbed and has a tendency to make everything about herself. She is literally in a high-stress situation, and instead of stepping back, starting to observe, take notes, she continues to tell everybody what she's interested in. Later, when Kirk asks, does anybody know anything about ESP? She immediately rushes forward to announce, I have a high ESP score. In fact, I can do all sorts of... Kirk interrupts her and says, that's not the question I asked. I need to know, does anybody know anything about ESP? And that's when Elizabeth reveals, well, actually, yes, she has useful information. Elizabeth had no problem being very direct in rejecting Gary's advances. Now, this is getting into heavy interpretation, but it could be argued that one of the reasons why Elizabeth was so willing to tell Gary to take a hike is because she was interested in Kirk. That's why she kept trying to talk to Kirk, trying to tell him all sorts of stuff about herself. But that old self-absorption thing rears its ugly head, because wrong place, wrong time. That might also help explain why old Gary was so quick to pounce, to immediately hit on Elizabeth as soon as he realized she might have some interest in Kirk, to take the girl away from Kirk even before he realized she was interested. And then when his powers start to manifest, he tries to dominate Elizabeth. It seems Gary has a great deal of jealousy and even deep-seated resentment towards Kirk. Then we see Elizabeth's compassion and concern for others when Kirk, Spock, and company are trying to figure out what the heck are they going to do with Gary and his newfound powers. She argues they shouldn't allow fear to cloud their judgment, that this was an amazing scientific opportunity, that maybe they could learn from Gary, figure out how they could activate these powers in other people, and that would be a net benefit for humanity. It's only when they decided to abandon Gary on an uninhabited planet and then her powers activated, so you could argue she figured they were going to abandon her anyhow, is when she helped Gary escape and run off into the wilderness in an attempt to create a new human race. It was when Gary tried to murder Kirk when Elizabeth acted, and you could argue she had a two-part motivation. First, she disagreed with Gary when it came to ESP. She thought it should be used to help humans instead of dominate them. And second, her attraction to Kirk made her want to stop Gary. It all comes down to choice. And I'm making the argument that the choices that Gary and Elizabeth made after they gained their powers were just a continuation of the same type of choices they had been making before they had power. It's just that, particularly in Gary's case, they no longer felt the need to hide who they were and the choices that they were making. Going back to Spinoza, as Gary was starting to realize he had some pretty amazing powers, he could have chosen to read any number of philosophers: Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, John Stuart Mill, philosophers that talked about self-control, discipline, self-sacrifice, respecting the rights of others. But no, instead, he chose to read Spinoza, a philosopher that he could easily twist to justify his previous behavior, treating people, including his so-called friend Kirk, as pawns to be manipulated as he saw fit, to now that he had the power to dominate and control humanity. Personally, I've always had an issue with the power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely argument, because it absolves the individual of any responsibility by denying them agency. Yeah, I did a lot of bad stuff when I was in power, but it's not really my fault because the power made me do it. I always take the side that power reveals character flaws, that power makes it easy for us to act on our darker desires. And if we do act on those dark desires, it reveals our lack of discipline and self-control. So I have a problem with Kirk covering it all up, putting into the official record that both Elizabeth and Gary died doing their duty. Now with Elizabeth, I could let it slide, because at the end, she did do the right thing, help put a stop to Gary. But Gary? No. And Kirk's argument that he didn't ask for this to happen to him, that is true, but he still chose to do the things that he did. So if it was me, I would have burned his reputation to the ground, particularly knowing what he had done in the past. Now, before somebody comes along and says, "You've never held that type of power, so you don't know what you've done." Well, what I do know is that several times in my life, I have been in some very powerful positions. And guess what? I never gave in to my darker impulses. I never let my shadow take over. And history is full of examples of similar people who didn't abuse their power. Now, granted, there are a lot more examples of people who have abused their power. So clearly it's not easy, but it can be done. What do y'all think? Does power corrupt, or does it reveal character? Do you think Kirk did the right thing by trying to protect Gary and Elizabeth's reputation, or should he have put everything they did in the official record? Tell me down in the comments below. At any rate, I hope I gave y'all something to think about, and until next episode, y'all be safe. If y'all are still here, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. While you're at it, why don't you like this video, subscribe to the channel, click that notification bell. You can hear me yammer on about something else next time. And feel free to share this video far and wide.
Please like and subscribe. Please leave a comment.